So thank you so much to everybody for joining. I'm William Masters. I'm a professor of economics and food policy at the Friedman School of Nutrition at Tufts University. And it's been just a real pleasure for me to work on this question of food prices for nutrition for a very long time, actually. We've been exploring food prices for centuries, trying to understand how they relate to people's well-being and to access to food and to ultimately a healthy diet. And I hope you'll agree that we've made some amazing breakthroughs in that recently. And Rachel Gilbert will share with you the basics of what we've been doing to start a conversation about how these data, how these results can be used for the research projects, for the evaluation, impact assessment, and the policy and program design. This is all part of this project on food prices for nutrition that Rachel will tell you about. And I was very, very happy to be able, in building this project, to be able to attract Rachel to the project and have Rachel work with countries one by one. So take advantage of Zoom, as we're doing today, to have conversations with people in each country where we've have the opportunity to work. So in this case, trying to convene people from within Bangladesh, but also people who are interested in working with Bangladeshis from outside of Bangladesh, just to have us talk about what are these data, what are the results, what do they mean, and how can you use them? So Rachel will take it from here to build and guide this community, what we hope will be a vibrant conversation today, and then over the coming months and years, as we find more and more surprising things in the food price data, in the analysis of diet costs and accessibility and affordability of an overall healthy diet. So Rachel, if you can, I think you have slides to share your screen. Thanks so much for joining, everybody.
Thanks, Will. Let me just get my slides going for you. I hope you can all see that. Is that
excellent? Yes.
Great. All right. Thanks very much for the introduction, Will. My name is Rachel Gilbert. And for those of you who I haven't been in touch with directly in the lead up to this webinar, as Will mentioned, I'm a researcher based at Tufts, and I'll be working on the Food Prices for Nutrition project, particularly with outreach to different countries about our work. So I'm really excited to gather this group from all over the world actually here to talk about measuring the cost and affordability of healthy diets in Bangladesh. As Will mentioned, this work has been going on for some time now. Some of you may be familiar with the Changing Access to Nutritious Diets in Africa and South Asia project, or CANDASA, which was the earlier iteration of this project. And we'll be talking now about the work that Food Prices for Nutrition is doing to disseminate the methods and the indicators that are used to measure diet costs. And our goal for today, as Will mentioned, is to tell you about the work so we can begin to engage on a deeper level with people in Bangladesh and elsewhere who are working with food prices. Thanks again very much for spending your time with us today. I know it's a very busy time. So in order to make the most of our time, I'll just quickly mention a few logistics. So the first is that we're currently recording the webinar, and we will post the recording on the website along with our slides. We'll also share them via email with all those who registered. So you'll be getting those. During the presentation, I'm going to ask everyone to keep themselves muted and turn off their video, just so we can reduce bandwidth for everyone. And we'd love you to introduce yourself in the chat, to comment in the chat. And if you have any burning questions, feel free to put them in the chat as well. We'll do our best to consolidate them or answer them in real time or at the end of the webinar. And we'll definitely leave time for questions at the end. So at that time, feel free to turn on your mic and your video and engage as much as you would like. So This project really starts with a vision that's probably very familiar to most of us here. And this is about the idea of food security. So the definition of food security that the global community has been using for the past 25 years is right here. When all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to meet dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. We're starting here because this framework provides a really strong vision, but a vision that we know many food systems in the world are not able to deliver on yet. So to highlight a few aspects of this definition that are important for the Food Prices and Nutrition Project, we have physical and economic access. So we're talking about availability and affordability. And we're also focusing on the nutritious food to meet dietary needs, which is a view of food that goes beyond calories and even beyond nutrient needs to include dignity and culture and the long-term protection of health. And we've had this vision for many years, and it's been hard to achieve in part because of a lack of data and methods for people to see and measure this problem. And really, we want to ask, how can we be accountable to this vision if we don't understand the availability and affordability of healthy diets? And that's a lot of what the Food Prices for Nutrition Project hopes to answer. So more specifically, what do we want to know? What are the central questions that we're asking about availability and affordability in our work? And the first is, if you went to the market in Bangladesh, how much would it cost to obtain a healthy diet? How many people in Bangladesh can afford that cost? And the answers to these questions are based in markets, in retail prices. And you can see the images here showing diverse foods from markets across the world. And you may be wondering why we're talking only about retail prices and markets when we know that food is also produced at home, can be received as gifts through social safety net programs, or even collected from the wild. But our metrics are based in retail prices and the prices that consumers find in markets, because even rural farm families rely on market purchases in addition to their own production for sufficient and healthy diets. So here we have some evidence from Ethiopia, from rural farm families. And you can see in this graph that the sources of calories from own production and purchased foods change throughout the year. So at certain times of the year, as you can see, in May and June here, purchased foods are as important or more important for calorie intake as own produced foods. Here, purchased foods contribute more than 1/3 of total calorie consumption in this study. And also importantly, you can see in this second graph that the types of foods that are purchased are often different from those that are produced at home or own produced. So you can see that vegetables, fruits, eggs, fish, and meat, these micronutrient-rich items, they're often seasonal and not everyone is able to produce them or even produce them throughout the year. So purchased foods from markets are very important for the availability of a diverse and healthy diet throughout the year. And this is true in many other parts of the world as well. Here we have some more recent data from rural India by Soumya Gupta and her colleagues. On the vertical axis, you can see we have the percentage of households that purchase each food group in the past week. So you can see that perishable and nutrient-rich items like vegetables are purchased by almost all households, particularly in certain months of the year. You can see meat, fish, and eggs. Those are purchased by approximately half of all households here. And things like oil, which is difficult to produce at the household level, is also purchased. So again, market reliance is important for overall and seasonal access to many different food groups in many locations, even where people are producing their own food. So to answer our questions about the retail cost and affordability of healthy diets, we estimate 3 least cost diets. The first benchmark diet is the energy sufficient diet, also known as the cost of calorie adequacy. And this diet represents the minimum cost to meet energy requirements using the least expensive available starchy staple food in each country. So for example, this might be the cost to buy enough rice or maybe maize to meet an individual's calorie needs for a day. So essentially the cost of basic survival needs in the short term. The next diet is the nutrient adequate diet, or the cost of nutrient adequacy. And this diet is calculated as the minimum cost to meet energy and nutrient requirements for 23 macro and micronutrients, taking into account upper bounds and lower bounds to avoid deficiency and toxicity. And this is a sort of theoretical benchmark in a way, because it's very difficult for a person to arrive in a market and know the exact amount of food that they would need to exactly meet their needs. But this is a very useful benchmark, the absolute minimum of what it would cost to theoretically meet all of your nutrient needs. And the final diet that we estimate is the healthy diet, which is also known sometimes as the cost of a recommended diet or the cost of a healthy diet. And this metric represents the minimum cost to meet food-based dietary guidelines, which are based on food group classifications. And these are recommended diets, usually by national governments. Not all countries have a food-based dietary guideline, and we'll talk about this in more detail. But dietary guidelines are a behaviorally realistic way to meet nutrient needs and other needs, including, as I mentioned before, diversity of the diet, cultural norms, and even protection of health against long-term non-communicable diseases. And these are a behavioral and often official government strategy meant for all people to meet their dietary needs. So these are the three diets. And to say a little bit more about least cost diets, I want to emphasize that these are the minimum cost that is theoretically possible, which is why we refer to these as benchmark diets. So they're the most affordable combination of foods that meet these criteria that I just mentioned. I also want to emphasize that there's no standard food basket. The foods selected in each of these least cost diets depend on time and place in the markets where we have food price data. So seasonal or locally available foods are selected. So there's no, for example, guideline that you must have mangoes, rice, and milk in a specific diet. You may have mangoes in the nutrient adequate basket in 1 month, and then the next month another item may become less expensive and replace mangoes in that diet. So seasonal items are included. And to demonstrate this, we can look at how the cost of a nutrient adequate diet composition changed in Malawi, for example, over a course of 9 years. So this is some work that Jan and Will did. You can see here that on the vertical axis, again, we have calories. So you can see that over time, the proportion of calories in the least cost basket from pulses, nuts, and seeds, you can see that there in green, declined slightly. So you can see over here in 2015, 2016, we have a smaller width of that green band, showing that the quantity of pulses declined over time. And you can also see that the light blue portion, which is fruits and vegetables, and the pink portion there, which is animal source foods, those grew over time between 2007, 2008, and 2015, 16. And you can see within these bands, within the year as well, you can see a lot of variation. And this represents changes in individual food items within these food groups at which were aggregated at. And you can see, again, this is aggregated at the national level as well, but these food baskets can be, and in fact were estimated at a district level. And to emphasize this point again, the least cost diet is not uniform across space or geography either. So it changes over time and space. Here we have the most common items in the cost of a healthy diet by state in India. So this is just a subset. But for example, you can see in each state that has a different group of least cost items. Although there are a lot of similarities, you can see, for example, bananas are present in all of the pictured states' healthy diets. But then in different states, guava or pineapple or papaya or mango will come in as they're the least expensive item. And this is the same for other food groups here as well. So this is all to emphasize that there is no standard food basket. And the last point I want to emphasize about the least cost diet method is that these are a conservative lower estimate of the cost per day. There are other features that would add to the cost of the diet. For example, incorporating preferences or convenience add to the cost of the healthy diet. And this leads me to what we call the ladder of affordability. This helps illustrate the increase in prices as we go from caloric adequacy to higher order goals. So you can see at the bottom step here, we have caloric adequacy as the least expensive diet, just achieving short-term subsistence. We need to pay more to get to nutrient adequacy, where we can avoid deficiencies and excesses of essential nutrients. And then we need to pay more again to get healthy diets, which meet food group recommendations and proportionality goals. And finally, incorporating goals like food safety and convenience and preferences. The cost rises again, as it does when we want to incorporate any additional goal. So this ladder of affordability helps us really clearly to see two very important insights. The first is that when diets are affordable, food prices are just one of many influences on food choice. For example, convenience, safety, and the like. There are various reasons why people who can afford a healthy diet may not achieve that. However, when healthy diets are unaffordable, food prices and the cost are an insurmountable barrier to improving diet quality. So now I'm going to transition to talking a little bit more about the food price data that we use and the methods. So we'll talk about sources of food price data, and I'll describe the cost of the nutrient adequate diet and healthy diet calculations in more detail. So to talk a little bit about price data, I'll go through a couple different sources. The first that many of you may be familiar with is household expenditure surveys. So things like the household income and expenditure surveys or integrated household surveys. These are large surveys which commonly ask households about their food consumption and the sources of their food. So whether the household has produced food themselves, purchased it, received it as a gift, so on. In the past 7 days, what have they consumed? And using this data, you can use the expenditure spent on purchased items to calculate the cost of food. And these surveys are exceptionally useful. They have oftentimes very rich food lists. And the food price data is, although sometimes a little bit complicated to work with, there's often diverse measurement units and representing different quality and different units that people buy foods in. But more importantly, a constraint to using these surveys for these calculations is that these surveys are only conducted every 5 to 10 years in most countries. So they're not a very frequent source of data. Another common source of data is for food price data is market information systems, which commonly track farm grade or wholesale food prices. So these are faced by farmers or producers or traders rather than the retail prices that consumers would face in the market. So these prices can be quite different, as you know, from things like transport or storage costs make a big difference between farm gate prices and the prices that a consumer would see. So these are useful for many things, but for calculating least cost diets, they may not always be the best source of data. Particularly, they may not include processed foods, which are also important for many consumers. There's also food price data available from vulnerability assessments and early warning systems, which often collect consumer prices to guide emergency interventions. So these are often collecting retail prices to guide emergency interventions, but they generally report prices for a smaller subset of items. And oftentimes these are not the diverse and perishable foods that are really important for healthy diets. And the last source of price data that I want to talk about is the World Bank International Comparison Program data set of global prices. I'll talk about this in part because it is the data source that was used for some of the global work in the Food Prices for Nutrition project. including the diet cost and affordability metrics that were included in the 2020 UN multi-agency report, the SOFI report, or the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World. But I also want to mention this because it's a very unique data set that is put together first and foremost for estimating purchasing power parities in the world's economies. And the most recent rounds of data were collected in 2005, 2011, and 2017. And the 2021 process is ongoing. This data set includes, the 2017 data set included 208 food and beverages, plus additional regional specific items. So this is an extremely rich data set. It's very high quality data set. And one caveat for using it for the types of diet cost methods that we're talking about today is that the items are limited to highly comparable products that are sold in multiple countries, because these are used for the purchasing power parity calculations. So ultimately, this data set provides a national annual average price for each item, which has been exceptionally useful for global comparisons, but allows for a little bit less nuance at the subnational level, for example. And another important source of price data, especially for national level work, is food price data that's collected by national governments for what's called the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. You may be familiar with this. It's used to track inflation and is part of existing national data collection systems in most countries. Most governments collect a lot of high frequency data, usually on a monthly or quarterly basis, and often in representative market locations. So this is a really huge undertaking that is a very impressive and quite a lot of work. So another feature of this data that's very useful for our purposes is that consumer price indices are generally weighted by the share of total expenditure. So these food price lists focus on foods which are commonly consumed by the population. So they're culturally acceptable, they're commonly consumed items, and these lists often include a lot of nutrient-dense foods like fruits, vegetables, and animal source foods like dairy, eggs, or meat, which are needed for calculating the cost of a healthy diet. And I also want to pause here to mention that the intention of the Food Prices for Nutrition project is to leverage the huge amounts of food price data that are already being collected around the world and use that data for nutrition. So there are many projects, specific projects or different contexts where you may find uses for all these other types of food price data that we've just talked about. But our intention at the Food Prices for Nutrition project is to leverage existing national and international data systems for nutrition. So using trusted and official government data can and should be used to inform policy. And now I'm going to talk about the calculation of the metrics using this food price data. So I'll start with the cost of nutrient adequacy. So in order to calculate the cost of nutrient adequacy, we take the food price data, which we've just been talking about, and combine it with food composition data. So food composition data tells us the calorie and nutrient content of foods. So imagine you have a list of food prices, for example, from the Consumer Price Index data collection. You match each food with its nutrient and energy content from food composition tables. Then we use linear programming to find the cheapest or lowest cost solution to the question, which combination of foods can meet all nutrient and energy requirements at the least cost? So linear programming involves the use of statistical software, data analysis software, as it's taking into account a huge number of possible diet combinations to determine which is the cheapest. So it's computationally intensive. And without going into too much detail here, the energy and nutrient requirements that are set for the linear programming of the nutrient adequate diet start first with caloric needs. So those are the estimated energy requirements, which are determined based on age, sex, weight, height, physical activity level. And then we use those to calculate acceptable ranges for macronutrients, So lower and upper levels for macronutrients like proteins, fats, and carbohydrates are determined using the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, which gives a range of acceptable proportions of calories to come from each macronutrient. Then for micronutrients, we need to set lower bounds to avoid deficiency and upper bounds to avoid toxicity. There are multiple ways to do this, for example, using estimated average requirements and upper limits. And these are described in a lot more detail in this wonderful resource that I've highlighted here, put together by our colleagues Kate Schneider and Anna Herforth. So I won't go into too much detail about that now, but these are the inputs into the linear programming model, which then again solves to find the combination and quantities of foods that meet these requirements at the lowest cost. And now to talk about the cost of a healthy diet and how we calculate the cost of a healthy diet. So in order to do this, we have to define or operationalize what a healthy diet is. We all know that there's no single definition of a healthy diet, but the way that we operationalize this is as a recommended diet based on quantitative food-based dietary guidelines. Almost 100 countries in the world have food-based dietary guidelines, and fortunately the FAO has done an amazing job of compiling national food-based dietary guidelines. They have them here in their online repository. And while there's no single definition across these dietary guidelines, there's a lot of convergence and many broad similarities across the existing guidelines. And in order to use these to calculate the cost of a healthy diet, to calculate this least cost diet, we need to use quantitative guidelines. So not all of these are quantitative guidelines. For example, we need to know, for example, how many servings are recommended per day and what a serving size is in grams. Not all national guidelines do this. Here we have the Bangladesh dietary guidelines, which were revised in 2013. This is a wonderful example of a detailed and quantitative food-based dietary guideline. So you can see here, there's the breakdown by food groups. We have rice and bread and other cereals at the bottom of the pyramid, with the largest number of servings recommended per day. We move up to fruits and vegetables and ultimately up to fats and oils and even sugars in this example. For our purposes, sugar is not included in the cost of a healthy diet. But you can also see here that the guideline provides information about the number of servings per day. So for example, for the fish, meat, and eggs, you see that we have 1 to 4 servings recommended per day. And then you also have information about the serving size, so the number of grams per serving. You can see 80 grams of fish here is 1 serving of fish. So this is an example of a food-based dietary guideline that is quantitative and can be costed using the cost of a healthy diet. And here is a set of 10 other national food-based dietary guidelines that have quantitative guidance. Again, there's a lot of similarities between these despite the geographical distribution. So we have Malta, India, Jamaica, Argentina. These are all national food-based dietary guidelines that can be costed. We also include the Eat Lancet diet here, which is a reference diet, which can be costed as well using the different food groups. And the specific steps to calculate the cost of a healthy diet, which do not require any of the linear programming of the cost of a nutrient adequate diet, are first is to categorize each food in the food price list according to the food groups that are enumerated in the selected dietary guideline. So for example, if you're using the Bangladesh dietary guidelines, you would take each food in your food price list and categorize it as, for example, rice, bread, or other cereals, maybe pulses, milk and milk products, so on. The next step is to remove certain items. So I mentioned earlier that sugar is not included in the cost of a healthy diet. Things like sugar sweetened beverages or sweets are not added are not included in the cost of a healthy diet because these add cost and they add calories, but they're extraneous to actual dietary needs. We also remove duplicate items, keeping only the lowest cost item. So for example, if you have local rice and imported rice, if the imported rice is more expensive, that will be dropped and not considered. And this is because we want to have a diverse diet, both within and across food groups. So when we have more than one food that might be included, we don't want to have two different kinds of rice included in the calculation. And in the third step, we calculate the price per day for each item. So in this step, we start with the price per kilogram, which is a very common unit of measurement that you might find, for example, a consumer price index food list to have the prices in price per kilogram. And you calculate the price per day by taking into account both the edible portion of the food, the number of servings that are required based on the food group, and the serving size for that food. So for example, the 1 to 4 servings of 80 grams of fish that we saw in the Bangladesh guidelines, taking into account the parts of the fish that you cannot eat. So we multiply the recommended quantity per day times the price per kilogram, accounting for edible portion. And this quantity altogether gives you the price per day for each food item. Now, one other portion of this, actually, sorry, let me just go back. So regarding the edible portions, just for example, we can take the guideline that is included in many food-based dietary guidelines, which is to eat 300 grams of vegetables per day. So the purpose is to know the quantity a consumer would need to purchase to meet the 300 gram guideline for vegetables for each vegetable in the food list. For some items, you would need to purchase 300 grams because the whole vegetable is edible. But for other things, like for something like a pumpkin, you may need to buy 600 grams because much of the product is not consumed directly, like the skin or the stem. And the same would be true for something like an avocado, which has a pit that needs to be accounted for. Now, once you have the cost per day per item, you can find the cheapest items in each food group. So in some cases, this may be just one item, and in other cases, it's 3. And again, this is to have diversity both within and across food groups, something that's really explicitly mentioned in food-based dietary guidelines. We usually take 1 item for oils, for example, 2 items for fruits, and 3 items for vegetables, and find the average price for those items. The final step here is to sum the cost for all food groups, getting the total cost for the diet. Just mute themselves, that would be great. I think we're getting a little bit of feedback. And now to move on to the final portion of the metrics to talk about the affordability of diets. So affordability is the comparison of the cost of something relative to a defined income standard. So we can compare the cost of the diet that we've just calculated to various standards. The first being poverty lines. So we could have compare it to a national or an international poverty line. So many of you are familiar with the international poverty line of $1.90 a day for food and non-food goods. We can also compare the cost to food expenditures or income. And in some cases, we compare these diet costs to wages, which we've done, different members of the team have done this in India and Ethiopia. These decisions are usually based on the data that's available and the question that you have. So many different ways to look at affordability. So before we move on, I just want to take a moment because I know many of you may be familiar with other initiatives that use food price data in similar ways. I just want to briefly mention how this effort differs from other projects and from what we've done in the past. Many of these initiatives, they're all extremely useful, and many of them look at a situational analysis or a very specific focus. But our emphasis here is on monitoring. So we want to be able to look over time and over seasons and have very current statistics on how access to healthy diets is changing. So we want to know this from month to month, from market to market. And to do this, we're focusing on leveraging the abundance of data that's already collected in existing systems. So as we've discussed before, one of these systems is the data collection that happens in every country for the Consumer Price Index. Most governments have a lot of high frequency data already, and we want to support countries to calculate metrics within their own data systems, or international agencies to calculate these metrics within their own systems that exist. Another important difference is moving to look beyond nutrients to look at healthy diet patterns, which harmonizes the approach with what governments themselves are recommending to citizens in food-based dietary guidelines. So there's a philosophical reason for that, which is that we can match the metric, what we're measuring, with the guidance that people receive that is behaviorally realistic. And then there's also a very pragmatic reason, which is that the cost of a healthy diet does not rely on linear programming, which again is computationally intensive, and the cost of a healthy diet is relatively easy to compute. So that removes a huge barrier to more frequent monitoring. So now I'm going to show you a sampling of results from 3 South Asian countries that food prices for nutrition researchers have calculated diet cost and affordability in, including Bangladesh, as well as some of the global results, particularly from the SOFI report. So what I hope you'll take away from these next slides is that these diet cost and affordability metrics can be used in a variety of ways to answer questions at the regional level, at the national level, and at the global level. So there's a lot of flexibility to use food price data and these metrics in particular to investigate different aspects of agricultural policy, different aspects of nutrition and health. So I'm going to start with some data from Pakistan, and I'll start by demonstrating how least cost diets and food prices can be used to look at variation across space using monthly price data. So this work was led by Felipe Dizon at the World Bank, along with Anna Herforth, one of the principal investigators on the Food Prices for Nutrition project. And the data used here are city level data collected by the National Bureau of Statistics. The cost of a healthy diet in this context, based on the NBS data, found that the cost of a healthy diet was 87 rupees, or $1.43 in US dollars. That calculation is more than half of what individuals in Pakistan spend less on food than that, suggesting that healthy diets are not affordable for many people in Pakistan. And more importantly, what I want to show you is that the map here demonstrates how the nominal price of achieving food-based dietary guidelines varies completely over this country. So we have red as the most expensive and green being the least expensive. And this type of calculation can help target areas for further investigation or programming. Another important feature of this study is that the process of calculating the cost of a healthy diet as a whole can demonstrate which food groups are the most expensive. So in this study, it was most expensive to meet the serving recommendations for dairy and vegetables. These food group costs had about double the variance of starchy staples in Pakistan. It's also possible and quite useful to look at which food groups costs vary the most across regions or across the areas in question. So you can see again what might be responsible for these big differences between the cities in the green and the red areas here. So in Pakistan, these were vegetables, dairy, and fruit. So that this may be that these foods are the most perishable, so they're not as easily transported, things like starchy staples or other dried goods. So this type of information can help prioritize interventions or programs to improve transportation or address perishability and cold chain issues to get nutrient-dense foods to be more accessible in the regions where they're not available or not affordable. And another important insight from this study is that prices for dark green leafy vegetables, which are sometimes required as part of a specific food-based dietary guidelines, were seasonally missing in Pakistan. So this is a very interesting insight about availability, and it highlights something to look into. Are dark green leafy vegetable prices just missing from the data set, or are they not available in markets? This is something that can give a lot of insight into how to improve the accessibility of these foods. And now I'll turn to some data on the cost and affordability of a healthy diet from India, where affordability was estimated relative to wages. This study was led by Kalyani Raghunathan of IFPRI. And here, monthly price data was collected at the market level in 24 states over a period of 10 years. And these prices were used to estimate the cost of a healthy diet. This data is collected again from government sources, from the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, and covers 101 food items. So a really rich data set, which also included data on wages. And in order to assess affordability, healthy diet costs were compared to unskilled laborers' wages, which were used as a proxy for the wages of those living in poverty. Something exciting about this data set is that the Indian wage data is actually disaggregated for men and women. And the Indian National Food-Based Dietary Guidelines are also provide guidance for men and women separately. So this allows a really deep comparison of the gender disparities. And we know actually from previous research that there are disparities in actual dietary intakes. And so these gender disaggregated diet costs can help investigate why this might be. And here we have this graphic just presents the percent change in the cost of the healthy diet relative to wages. So this is between 2001 and 2011. You can see that the bars to the left of the center demonstrate diets becoming more affordable. So you can see here that in most states, healthy diets became more affordable for men over time. So the data for men are showed in these darker bars, and you can see that for most states, the healthy diet is becoming more affordable for men over time. In contrast, you can see that over here, there's many situations where the lighter gray bars are going in the opposite direction, suggesting that there are really large increases in the cost of a healthy diet relative to women's wages in certain states. So these are less affordable diets over time. And of course, this data was also possible to look just more broadly at affordability. So this study found that between 63 and 76% of the rural poor could not afford a healthy diet in 2011. This is a really interesting application of this unique data set on gendered wages. And now, of course, as a last national example, we'll talk about how household survey data was used to assess the cost of a healthy diet for Bangladesh. So at the time of the study, there was no National Consumer Price Index data available to calculate the cost of a healthy diet for Bangladesh. So the data in this study come from the 2016 Household Income and Expenditure Survey, again, in which prices can be derived from household food expenditures. So here households are reporting all the food items consumed over the past 7 days and their source. So prices can be calculated for purchased items. And this data for over 45,000 households estimated the cost of a healthy diet at approximately 58 Bangladeshi taka, or $1.70 in 2011 purchasing power parity. So another really useful way that household expenditure survey data can be used is to determine affordability, as well as to compare least cost diets with actual food group expenditures. This is a wonderful feature of the household survey data. You can see in the figure on the right here, on the cost of a healthy diet, or the cost of a recommended diet, cord is here on the left. And you can compare this to the relative to actual expenditures, which are on the right there, by food group. So in orange here, you can see that the cost of a healthy diet, the expenditures on protein source foods were actually much higher than the least cost option. And this really aligns with the idea of preferences adding cost to the least cost diet. So in orange, we see that the least cost way to meet protein needs was about 20 cents in 2011 US dollars. And then the actual expenditures on protein foods in households was about 70 cents. So quite a difference. And again, this is demonstrating how food preferences can be incorporated. And we have a wonderful example of this demonstrated in Myanmar, where you can estimate the cost of a healthy diet incorporating food preferences. Now that we've looked at specific national and subnational analyses using price data from national statistical organizations and household survey data, I'll show you some estimates from the global analysis of diet cost and affordability that appeared in the 2020 SOFI report, the UN multi-agency report on the state of food security and nutrition. Again, this global analysis uses the unique price data set from the International Comparison Program at the World Bank, which I mentioned earlier, which is incredibly useful for comparison across countries, but that's providing a national annual average price per food item for a list of comparable food items across the world. And you can see here that the estimates were calculated for, this is just demonstrating these in Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, because that's just a subset of all of the data that's included in the SOFI report. But you can see that there are estimates calculated for the energy sufficient diet and the cost of calorie adequacy, the nutrient adequate diet, and the healthy diet. For each country, you can also see the estimated cost, the cost as a percentage, oh, excuse me, there we go. The estimated cost of the diet, then the cost as a percentage of average food expenditure per capita in each country, and then as the percent which is unaffordable. You can see that in some cases, so we can see this ladder of affordability. So in Bangladesh, we start with the energy sufficient diet at about 64 cents. Going up to the nutrient adequate diet, the cost is about $1.63 per person per day. And going up to the healthy diet, it jumps all the way to $3.54. So this is the idea of this ladder of affordability. The cost of diets rising as we add in additional healthy benefits. And you can also see here that in some cases, the percent of food expenditure for the cost of the healthy diet is more than 100%. So for example, in India, the healthy diet actually costs more than average food expenditures on average, over 118%. And finally, to broaden our view a little bit, I'll show you the global picture that we get from the SOFI 2020 report and why measuring these diet costs are so important. So a crucial insight from the SOFI report is we see that 3 billion people globally lack sufficient income to purchase least cost healthy diets. And we also saw that calorie affordability or basic survival needs is still a serious problem in some countries. We also see that the cost of a nutrient adequate diet is represented in the map here. Most people in sub-Saharan Africa cannot afford nutrient adequate diets. And as we move towards the healthy diet, most people in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia cannot afford healthy diets either. So these insights are really useful in getting a global picture as well. And finally, the work done in the SOFI report showed us that healthy diets, by any definition, are far more expensive than the entire international poverty line. You can see here the cost of healthy diets for 10 different national food-based dietary guidelines. So you remember some of the ones I showed earlier, and the Eat Lancet reference diet, all of which were calculated for the SOFI report. So you can see here that the median of these least cost healthy diets is $3.75 per person per day. That is much higher than the $1.90 a day international poverty line, which includes both food and non-food spending. And the difference is, of course, even larger if you take into account the upper bound of the poverty line that can credibly be reserved for food, which is about $1.20. So These are really crucial realizations that food price data and these diet cost metrics can bring about, both at the global level and then, as we saw earlier, at the national level and even at the regional level as well. So we can use this information to start thinking about how best to use social safety nets to increase availability of healthy foods and how to sustainably and equitably make healthy diets more affordable. And now, before I stop and take your questions, I'll just tell you a little bit about the next steps for the Food Prices for Nutrition project. So as I mentioned earlier, this project continues to build on the work done in previous projects, such as Candasa. And now we're working with, so again, I'm representing Tufts, and we have our colleagues at the World Bank, the International Comparison Program Global Office, as well as the International Food Policy Research Institute. And we're focused on promoting the use of food prices to measure diet costs and affordability and to scale up monitoring and analysis. So to do this, we're focused on three main things: providing tools, methods, and data to calculate and use the metrics, in large part through a data hub and e-learning courses that the World Bank are developing. And also through the support of the use of metrics within existing country systems through things like outreach and these in-country discussion forums that we're hoping to start, as Will mentioned earlier. And finally, through modeling impacts of policies and programs to influence food prices. Some things that are coming soon from the project. So one important tool that we're working on is a database of food item quantities required for computing the cost of a healthy diet. So this is the type of information that combines information on edible portions and serving sizes and the size of each portion for different food-based dietary guidelines, which we talked about when we were talking about the calculating the cost of a healthy diet. And these tools and guides will make it easier for people who already have food price data to compute the cost of a healthy diet without needing to use food composition data, which can be a much more time-intensive process. So pretty soon, next, I believe Monday, the 21st of June, we'll be talking about very similar things to today, but we'll be talking a little bit more about these tools and doing a little bit of practice of calculating the cost of a healthy diet. So if anyone is interested, you are welcome to join the Learning Lab at ANH Academy Week on the cost and affordability of nutritious diets. I just showed you estimates for the SOFI 2020 report, and updated estimates for 2021 will be launched with the SOFI report in July. And finally, the World Bank e-learning course is coming next year in August 2022. The Food Prices for Nutrition e-learning course will be hosted on the World Bank's Open Learning Campus platform. So right here we have an example. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with the course that talks about the fundamentals of purchasing power parities, but a similar course will be conducted for the diet cost and affordability metrics. This will be a 3-hour self-paced course for government officials, program planners, researchers, and really anyone who's interested, with 2 separate modules. The first on the construction of diet cost indices in more detail than we've just talked about. And secondly, the use and potential applications of these indices in relation to policymaking. So that will be a very exciting thing to share with you in a year or so. We'll open up in just a moment for questions. If you would like to provide us feedback on this webinar, and if you want to stay in touch and get information about future work from the Food Prices for Nutrition project, you can register that interest with this Google form. I think we can share this link in the chat as well in just a moment. You can also find a lot of information on our website. And as always, please reach out directly to me or others with questions or interest. In particular, we'll be creating food priced interest groups in each of our 9 focus countries. So as Will mentioned, this is to bring together groups of people who are already working with or interested in working with food price data and metrics such as these. So if you're interested in this type of thing and being involved in smaller group discussions about how to scale the use of food price data and analysis in Bangladesh, you can feel free to reach out to me directly. We'll be forming these groups in each country that we focus on in the project, including Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and South Asia, and then Malawi, Nigeria, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Burkina Faso as well. And that's all I have. Thanks very much for staying with me for this presentation, and thanks also to our donors, the Gates Foundation and UK Aid. And now I'm gonna open it up for questions. So I'm hoping there are some questions in the chat, and I really encourage people to turn on their video and unmute if they want to ask a question, and maybe we'll take a few and answer them. We'll just see what kinds of questions you all have. Stop sharing here. You can also email me with any questions and we'll get back to you as well. Great. All righty. So does anyone have any questions? I see I'll catch up a little bit here in the chat. I haven't read all of these, but if Julia, did you notice any questions that we should address up front? Great. Okay. We have a question from Janet in about who our partner is in Tanzania. Let's see. I'm going to just check a little bit. Good question about countries without quantitative food-based dietary guidelines, which Will has touched on. So right, and we have this question from Martha. In the absence of quantitative food-based dietary guidelines, what options are best for calculating the healthy diet? So Will has responded here. So far, what we've done is combine the food-based dietary guidelines from different countries to extract their common features and find that they're very similar. So countries different, example foods, imagery, and language, but the definitions are very similar. That's true. So there's a couple of other things that I'll mention. For example, in Africa, many of the diet cost calculations have been done using the Benin is the only quantitative food-based dietary guideline. So many people have used that, and that's a perfectly acceptable choice. There's also in South Asia, I believe there's been some cross-country analyses using a regional composite of different food-based dietary guidelines. So that's another possibility. And another thing that we're working on, which we didn't talk too much about today, which we'll also touch on a bit in the ANH Academy Week Learning Lab, is a composite diet called a healthy diet basket, which combines food-based dietary recommendations across guidelines. So we'll be talking about that more in the future as an option. That's a bit simpler and also possible to use for countries that don't have their own food-based dietary guideline. So Wamek has said, do you have any plans to reach out to the government to communicate these findings, and what a best possible outcome in terms of policy reach for this analytical work? That's a wonderful question. So certainly the goal, and part of the goal of this webinar, is to communicate these results very broadly, both to government partners and to people throughout civil society. We, as the project progresses, particularly with work with the World Bank and through the e-learning course, we will be talking much more closely with government partners to see who's interested in learning more about these things, and to talk with the Bureau of Statistics, for example, or other organizations that are involved in the collection of food price data to partner with them. So yes, that is a best possible outcome, I suppose, would be the monitoring of the cost of a healthy diet in this national data system. So for example, somebody within the government being able to calculate and monitor this on their own using the data that they already collect. Will, I see you've unmuted. Did you want to add something?
Oh, no, sorry, that was just a mistake. I was just typing.
No. Yeah, no problem. Okay, I'm trying to Will's also mentioned, yes, that we have no individual partners in each country. We're convening again, these open interest groups. So please feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email again in the chat, although I think many of you do have it already. But we're planning on convening these groups, which we hope to include government partners, again, researchers, people from all different aspects of civil society as well, to talk about food prices and the scaling up of the use of these metrics and how they can be used, particularly at the national level. But of course, it's also possible, as we mentioned, to use these at a project specific level for a specific program. Really, anyone who has food price data is able to use these for different purposes. So,
and while Rachel is looking through the chat, I just wanted to mention that each of us in the chat box have entered very interesting different kinds of questions. And that's exactly the kind of complementarity that we're hoping that this conversation can bring out, where, for example, Wamek was just talking about the food lists of the prices that are collected. And so that would come from, in conversations with Bureau of Statistics and so forth. Then there's a question of what can research partners do and what can implementing agencies, people from Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Health, as well as NGOs. So I think one big question coming out of today is, who else could you bring into the conversation? If there are people who might want to just watch the recording of today or engage with Rachel, with us, and with you on next steps, things that you could do with these data.
Yeah, exactly.
And Will and Rachel, yeah, I probably just would like to highlight things from the data perspective. As we know that, especially for more frequent data and also for sub-regional or national data, which are really important. And if any of you know the context from the National Stats Bureau or National Stats Offices, that also would be great, because we are also considering to collaborate with more national stats offices and to collect more higher quality and higher frequent data for time theory analysis and also subnational analysis, the spatial analysis, which are can be potentially done in the future.
Yeah, and just to mention, we did, of course, invite people from the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics. Unfortunately, none of them could make it today, but we will share this presentation and this information with them as well. But of course, we really do hope that people will share all of this very widely. And what I'm particularly seeking and working on is connection with people in the country and to talk about how we can better get these discussion groups started. So I'll be working on that for quite a while. And I'm really excited to get that discussion group and interest group going. So I see a lot of people offering to connect us, which is great. And thanks, Jan, for jumping in. I think, Tanema, did you want to jump in with your question?
Yeah, thanks. I'm Tonima Sharmin from World Food Program Bangladesh. So it was really nice to have your presentation, comprehensive presentation. You already mentioned that we did a similar exercise, fill the nutrient gap analysis globally, WFP globally, and also for Bangladesh. So it's really nice to see the similar cost analysis from your university. So I would like to mention that we also use the same data set, same food price data from a household income expenditure survey from 2016, and also we did it under the cabinet division of Bangladesh. So we had also communicated with Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics. So all the data sets that we got for the analysis in 2019, we actually finished our analysis. The report is still under finalization, but I would like to mention that we also struggle that the food prices data from 2016, which is quite old, and we did it in 2019. So it was really a kind of a queries or questions from the government side and also the audience that how it can be relevant from using the 2016 data, which was actually the latest data till now. So that was one thing. Secondly, that was the least cost food we calculated, like you also mentioned, but that was also struggle that there are a lot of factors actually are there, like food preferences and other things. The food prices also varies in geographical. So those thing we also face. But one thing I would like to mention, that it would be nice to know or interact with you further, that we also got the amount, the minimum amount is kind of 174 BDT, compared to your amount is kind of 58. For our one was, we called it optimized nutritious diet. So we really would like, it would be interesting to look at what are the food groups, because we use the same data set, food prices data. So definitely it would be nice to see or interact with you further, the differences. Okay, thank you. Over.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that's very interesting. And it will be great to connect more about that. I should also mention that we have been in touch with World Food Program in a couple of other countries, specifically in Ethiopia, to sort of link some of the work, because both the use of the cost of a nutrient adequate diet, or for example, the cost of the diet and the fill the nutrient gap analysis that the World Food Program does, they're really complementary. They're provide different information that's useful for a whole lot of purposes. And I think what we want to highlight is that the cost of a healthy diet is particularly useful for monitoring, but the really deep situational analysis that can come from the work that, for example, Fill the Nutrient Gap does, the World Food Program, and with the cost of a nutrient adequate diet can be complementary. And so we're really hoping that both of these metrics will be used in different ways to provide a lot of insight, and hopefully, yes, with newer food price data and hopefully some retail food prices as well. Thanks very much for that. And just in a similar vein, Nazma, I see your hand is raised. I know you've been working on similar things as well. Did you want to share your question or comment?
In fact, I want to share my recently completed study on nutrient density of habitual and affordable desirable diet in Bangladesh according to life cycle stage, region, and vulnerability. We identify the nutrient gap by using the two survey. One is INFS-FAO survey, which is that survey consumption data collected at the individual level, not the household expenditure survey, which is individual consumption, which is not the individual consumption survey. And another survey is BIHS, Bangladesh Integrated Household Survey, 2015. So we identified the nutrient gap from that two different survey, nationally representative survey. One is BIHS is the rural one, and INFS-FAO survey is the rural urban, both national data. And from that, we analyze the cost and affordability of recommended healthy diet. In fact, we analyze the three different diet. One is energy sufficient diet. Another one is the nutrient adequate diet. And another one is recommended healthy diet according to desirable dietary guideline. And we also find out the regional variation and also the life cycle stage variation. And from that, we developed the least cost food basket by using the linear programming, food composition data. And also we did the price data collection at January 2021, end of the January 2021. This price data collected from the whole Bangladesh, 8 division and 3 different market, 1 rural, urban and 2 rural. So this price data is the very recent price data. So we have the cost of energy sufficient diet, nutrient adequate diet, and recommended healthy diet. And we also estimate the affordability and how much household can afford. We also that type of data also. And already report is finalized, and most probably 28th to 23rd, we will disseminate the findings of this study.
Great. Yeah, it's really wonderful to hear all of the things that people are working on, and a really important part of this project, again, is bringing together all of the work that's being done and trying to compile these groups so this information can be shared. And we're very excited to see your report, Nazma, when you're able to share it with us, and to learn more about the food price data that you use. That sounds really exciting. And I think, Anwar, did you have a question as well?
I'm working in Nutrition International. My question is that the data you use from Bangladesh probably so far is from 2006. Present.
Anwar, you're breaking up
So,
quite a bit. It's hard to get the question.
Is it possible to get the real calculation? It's number one. Well, can you hear me now? Is it better now? Hello?
It's okay.
Hello?
You're coming in and out. It might be easier to type the question in the chat if at all possible. We can hear you, but intermittently. So
Okay, just I'm leaving my question now. Well, I think you just use the data for Bangladesh. It is 2016. But if you compare the price of now, maybe is it possible to get the real expenditure cost from it? Thank you.
So I think what you're asking, if I'm understanding correctly, is whether you could adjust those prices for inflation to get the real prices, or if there's, perhaps you're asking if there's more recent price data that can be used. And presumably there is more recent data that can be used. I'm not sure that it's publicly available, which is an ever-present question. But of course, the CPI could be used to adjust, the broader categories of the CPI could be used to adjust for inflation to update those costs. But of course, the better solution, I think, would be to use more recent food price data, if possible. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but, or if others have thoughts on that, because other people may have insights as well. Great, we have Mohammed also sharing another cost of the diet study in one division of Bangladesh, which is great. Yes, using the cost of the diet software. Again, this is really exciting to see all the different work that people are doing, either in specific areas or especially Nazma, you talking about looking at regional differences and different age groups. This is exactly the kind of information that's great to share and discuss. So I hope I'm not missing any other questions at the moment. We're about at the end of time. I just want to say thank you again so much, all of you, for joining. I hope this is the beginning of a lot more discussion and hopefully interaction about our work in the Food Prices for Nutrition project, and all of the wonderful work that everyone here is doing. We'll be really happy to hear from you. And I think I'll just again share the feedback form in the chat if you are able to fill that out. That's wonderful. We'll also share all of this information with you, and please share it widely with anyone who you think should have been here today that couldn't make it, or that you want to bring into this conversation. We're really excited to engage with you all. And thanks again.
Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.